Business class cabin. The sound of wine glasses clinking and soft laughter. A woman in a white suit glanced at the man sitting in the back row. "You don't belong up here, do you?" He just smiled, clutching his worn backpack, saying nothing. When the plane shook violently, warning lights flashed red. The co-pilot screamed into the radio, "We've lost hydraulic pressure." A flight attendant frantically called out, "Is there any pilot on board?" The man stood up, removed his jacket, revealing a silver badge on his sleeve. "I flew F-16s. Let me through." Ethan Ward was 39 years old, a single father, a former F-16 fighter pilot, now just a civilian mechanical engineer. His wife died in a plane crash 5 years ago. Since then, he raised their daughter Amelia alone. She was 10 now. Smart, brave, his entire world. Every penny Ethan earned went to Amelia's future. Piano lessons, school supplies, college savings. He wore the same jacket for 3 winters. He never complained. Today he was flying to Denver for a contract job. An airline needed someone to inspect their aircraft engines. The pay was good, enough to cover Amelia's summer camp. He carried a worn canvas backpack. Inside were his tools, a sandwich wrapped in foil, and a silver badge. The badge read Wings of Valor. It was from his old unit, the Thunderbirds. He never wore it, but he always carried it. Ethan boarded the plane. His ticket said Seat 3A, business class. The company had paid for it. He felt out of place. The cabin smelled like expensive perfume and leather. Passengers wore designer suits and gold watches. They talked about mergers and stock options. Ethan sat down quietly. He placed his backpack under the seat. A man across the aisle glanced at him, then looked away. Then she arrived, Clara Voss, 32 years old, CEO of a tech company called Voss Corp. Her company made AI software for Fortune 500 firms. She was brilliant, ambitious, and completely convinced of her own superiority. She wore a white Armani suit. Her heels clicked sharply on the floor. She had the aisle seat next to Ethan. Clara sat down, already annoyed. She pulled out her laptop. Then she noticed the backpack near her feet. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp. "That bag smells like oil." Ethan looked up. "Sorry, I can move it." "You should." She wrinkled her nose. "And what's with all that clinking? Do you have tools in there?" "Yes, for work." Clara typed something on her laptop. She didn't look at him. "Let me guess. Construction? Plumbing? Aircraft maintenance?" She laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "So you fix planes, and they put you in business class?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Company policy." "Right." Clara went back to her screen, but she couldn't resist. "You know, I read somewhere that most mechanics could never actually fly the planes they fix. Funny, isn't it?" Ethan said nothing. He just looked out the window. Clara kept going. "I mean, it's like being so close to greatness, but never quite reaching it. Must be frustrating." He turned to her. His eyes were calm, patient. "Some people don't need to prove what they've done." Clara smirked. "That's exactly what failures say." The flight attendant came by with champagne. Clara took a glass. Ethan declined. "Water, please." Clara rolled her eyes. She leaned back in her seat, satisfied with herself. She had meetings in Denver, important ones, investors, partnerships. Her company was about to go public. She was going to be on the cover of Forbes. This man next to her, he was nobody, just another face in the crowd. Someone who peaked early and settled for less. She didn't know his name. She didn't care. But in 20 minutes, she would learn it. In 30 minutes, she would need him. And in 40 minutes, she would realize that greatness doesn't wear labels. It wears silence. 20 minutes into the flight, Clara was bored. She closed her laptop, looked at Ethan. He was reading a paperback book, something about aviation history. "So," she said, "what's your story?" Ethan didn't look up. "Don't really have one." "Oh, come on, everyone has a story." She sipped her champagne. "Let me guess. You wanted to be a pilot once?" He turned a page. "Once?" Clara laughed. "I knew it. And let me guess again. You washed out? Failed the training? Something like that. She leaned closer. Her voice was mocking now. You were a pilot? Or you wanted to be one? There's a big difference. Ethan finally looked at her. His expression was neutral. I was. Really? Clara's eyebrows went up. What did you fly? Crop dusters? Tour helicopters? Fighter jets. She burst out laughing. Actually laughing. Other passengers glanced over. Fighter jets? You? She shook her head. No offense, but you don't exactly look like Top Gun material. Ethan went back to his book. None taken. So what happened? Why are you fixing planes instead of flying them? Life happened. That's a cop-out answer. Clara finished her champagne. You know what I think? I think you're lying. I think you were maybe in the Air Force doing paperwork or something, and now you tell people you flew fighter jets to feel important. Ethan closed his book. He looked at her directly. You're entitled to your opinion. You're not even going to defend yourself? Why would I? Clara smiled, a cruel smile. Because it's pathetic, living in the past, pretending you were something you weren't. Meanwhile, people like me are actually building the future. Good for you. You know what your problem is? She was enjoying this now. You gave up. You settled. You're sitting in business class, but you're still coach on the inside. Ethan said nothing. He just looked out the window. Clara felt victorious. She pulled out her phone and started texting her assistant. Then the plane shook. Not turbulence. This was different. A violent jolt that made the overhead bins rattle. The seatbelt sign turned on. A chime sounded. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Clara gripped her armrest. What kind of technical difficulties? Ethan was calm. Too calm. He looked at the wings through the window. Another jolt. Harder this time. Someone screamed in economy. The plane tilted slightly to the left, then corrected, then tilted again. Warning lights flashed above the cabin. Red, then yellow, then red again. A flight attendant rushed past, her face pale. Clara's confidence vanished. What's happening? Ethan watched the wing. Hydraulic failure. Maybe both systems. How do you know that? The way the plane is moving. It's not responding right. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice again. But this time it was strained. We have lost primary and backup hydraulic pressure. We are attempting to stabilize the aircraft. Please remain calm. Clara wasn't calm. Her hands were shaking. Oh my God, oh my God. Ethan turned to her. His voice was steady. Take deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Are we going to crash? Not if they can control it. If. The plane dropped. Just for a second. But it felt like forever. Passengers screamed. Bags fell from overhead compartments. Clara grabbed Ethan's arm. Her nails dug into his jacket. I don't want to die. You won't. How do you know? Because panic doesn't fly. She stared at him. For the first time, she really looked at him. His eyes were clear, focused. There was no fear in them. The flight attendant ran to the front of business class. She picked up the internal phone. Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Captain's unconscious. Co-pilot needs help. Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Silence. Nobody moved. Clara looked around. Wealthy businessmen, tech executives, lawyers, all frozen in their seats. The flight attendant was almost crying now. Please, anyone, commercial pilots, military, anything. Still nothing. Then Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up. Every eye in business class turned to him. Clara whispered, What are you doing? Ethan reached into his backpack. He pulled out the silver badge. Wings of Valor. He pinned it to his shirt. Then he looked at Clara. Some flights aren't on schedules. He walked toward the cockpit. His steps were steady, confident. The flight attendant saw the badge. Her eyes went wide. You're a pilot? Was. F-16s. Thunderbirds unit. 15 years. Can you fly this? I can try. She grabbed his arm like he was a lifeline. The captain had a heart attack. The co-pilot is trying to hold it together, but we're losing altitude. We need. I know what you need. Let me through. The cockpit door opened. Ethan disappeared inside. Clara sat frozen in her seat. Her champagne glass was still in her hand. She couldn't feel her fingers. Around her, passengers were praying, crying, holding each other. She looked at the empty seat next to her, the worn backpack, the book about aviation, and she realized something. The man she had mocked for the last hour was now the only thing standing between her and death. Would you trust the man everyone ignored to save you? Ethan stepped into the cockpit. The scene was chaos. The captain slumped in his seat, unconscious. His face was gray. The co-pilot was 25, maybe younger. Sweat poured down his face. His hands shook on the controls. Warning alarms screamed. Red lights flashed across every panel. "Who are you?" the co-pilot gasped. "Ethan Ward, former Air Force, F-16 pilot, 15 years. The young man's eyes filled with hope. "Can you help?" Ethan looked at the instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure, 0. Backup system, offline. Altitude, dropping. "I can try. What's your name?" "Marcus." "Okay, Marcus, talk to me. What happened?" Captain grabbed his chest, collapsed. Then the hydraulic system failed. Both lines. "I can't control the ailerons. The rudder barely responds." Ethan sat in the captain's seat. He moved the unconscious man aside gently. "How much fuel?" 40 minutes, maybe less." "Nearest airport?" "Denver. 15 minutes if we can hold altitude." Ethan gripped the controls. The plane felt wrong, sluggish, like trying to steer a car with flat tires. "Marcus, listen to me. We're going to use differential thrust." "What?" "Engine power. We'll steer with the throttles. I did it once in an F-16 over Afghanistan. Lost all hydraulics after taking fire." "This isn't a fighter jet." "Same physics, bigger plane. We adjust thrust on each engine to turn. It's crude, but it works." Marcus stared at him. "You're serious? Do you have a better idea?" "No." "Then trust me." Ethan pushed the left throttle forward. The plane tilted slightly right. He pulled it back. Pushed the right throttle. The plane responded. Barely. "It's working," Marcus whispered. "Get on the radio. Tell Denver we're coming in with no hydraulics. We need the longest runway in every emergency vehicle they have." Marcus grabbed the radio. "Denver Tower, this is Flight 227. We have total hydraulic failure and are attempting emergency landing using differential thrust." Static. Then a voice. "Flight 227, confirm. Did you say differential thrust?" "Affirmative." "Who's flying that plane?" Ethan leaned toward the microphone. "Former Air Force, call sign Reaper. I'm bringing her in." A pause, then, "Copy that, Reaper. Runway 34 is clear. Wind is calm. You're cleared for approach." Ethan looked at Marcus. "Now here's the hard part. We can't use flaps. No hydraulics means no flaps. We're coming in fast." "How fast?" 200 knots, maybe more. That's twice normal landing speed." "I know. The runway is 10,000 feet. We'll use every inch." Marcus's voice cracked. "What if we overshoot?" "We won't." "But what if—" "Marcus." Ethan's voice was firm, calm. "Fear is natural, but doubt kills. Right now I need you to believe we can do this." The young co-pilot took a breath, nodded. "Okay. Good. Now watch the airspeed. Call out every 10 knots as we descend." Behind them, the cockpit door opened. The flight attendant looked in. "How bad is it?" Ethan didn't turn. "We're going to land hard. Tell everyone to brace. Remove all sharp objects. Shoes off. Heads down. No exceptions." She nodded and left. The plane descended. Slowly. Ethan adjusted the throttles constantly. Left. Right. Left again. Every movement was precise. "Airspeed 220, Marcus called. "Good. Altitude 2,000 feet. Give me the landing gear." Marcus flipped a switch. A grinding sound. The landing gear deployed manually. "Gear down and locked." "Distance to runway?" 5 miles. Ethan could see Denver now. The city spread below them. The airport ahead. Tiny from this height. He thought of Amelia. Her smile. Her voice on the phone last night. Love you, Dad. Be safe. Always, sweetheart. He would keep that promise. Airspeed 210. Altitude 1,000. The plane shook. A hard gust of wind hit them sideways. Ethan compensated, throttled the left engine up. The plane straightened. 3 miles. In the cabin, passengers were crying, praying, holding hands with strangers. Clara sat rigid, her eyes closed. She whispered over and over, "Please, please, please." The man she had mocked, the man she had called a failure. He was in that cockpit right now, fighting for her life. 2 miles. Ethan's hands moved across the controls like a pianist. Muscle memory, 15 years of training, hundreds of combat missions, thousands of hours in the air. This was different. This was commercial, heavier, slower. But physics didn't lie. Thrust was thrust. Lift was lift. 1 mile. Airspeed 200. The runway appeared below them, long, gray, lined with foam. Emergency vehicles lined both sides. Ambulances, fire trucks, lights flashing. 500 feet. Ethan's voice was ice-cold calm. "Marcus, when we touch down, reverse thrust immediately. I'll handle the throttles. You handle the brakes." "Got it." 300 feet. The ground rushed up to meet them. 200. 100. 50. "Brace!" Marcus shouted into the intercom. The wheels hit. The impact was massive, like dropping a building onto concrete. The plane bounced, came down again. Harder. Metal screamed. Rubber burned. Ethan pulled both throttles into reverse. The engines roared in protest. Marcus stood on the brakes. The plane shuddered. Decelerated, but not fast enough. "We're not stopping," Marcus yelled. "Yes, we are." Ethan pushed the throttles harder. The engines screamed louder than the alarms. The end of the runway was coming. Fast. 5,000 feet left. 3,000. 1,000. The plane was slowing. Barely. 500 feet. 200. 50. The plane stopped. 10 feet from the end of the runway. Silence. Complete silence. Then Marcus started laughing, crying, both at once. "We're alive! We're alive!" Ethan unbuckled. His hands were steady. "Get the captain to the paramedics and open the doors." "What about you?" "I'll check the cabin." Ethan walked out of the cockpit. The cabin erupted. Passengers stood, clapped, screamed with joy. Strangers hugged each other. People sobbed. A businessman grabbed Ethan's hand. "You saved us. You saved all of us." Ethan just nodded, kept walking. He reached Clara's row. She was still sitting, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at him. "You saved us all," she whispered, "after everything I said to you." Ethan picked up his backpack from under the seat. He looked at her. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't triumphant. It was just tired. "I didn't hear you then," he said quietly. The engines were too loud. He walked toward the exit. Clara sat there, watching him go. The man she had called a failure had just saved 162 lives, including hers. The news spread like wildfire. Former fighter pilot saves 162 lives on Flight 227. Every major network covered it. CNN, Fox, BBC, Al Jazeera. Ethan's photo was everywhere. Standing on the tarmac, wearing his old jacket, the Silver Wings of Valor badge pinned to his chest. Reporters camped outside his apartment. They wanted interviews, book deals, movie rights. He declined everything. "I just did what anyone would do," he told them. Then he closed the door. But the internet had other ideas. Someone on the flight had been recording. A passenger 3 rows back had captured everything. Clara's mocking tone, her cruel laughter, every dismissive word. "You're sitting in business class, but you're still coach on the inside." The passenger posted it online with the caption, "This CEO mocked the man who later saved all our lives." The video went viral. 10 million views in 24 hours, 50 million by the end of the week, 100 million by day 10. The comments section exploded. "This is what privilege looks like. She judged a hero and almost died because of it. Imagine being saved by the man you insulted an hour earlier." He had every right to let her suffer, but he didn't. That's character. News outlets dissected every frame. Body language experts analyzed her expressions. Social media created memes. The hashtag Respect the Quiet Ones trended worldwide for 3 days straight. Clara's company released a statement. Ms. Voss's comments do not reflect the values of Vosscore, but the damage was done. Her board called an emergency meeting. Investors pulled out. Partners canceled contracts. 3 days after the flight, Clara stood in front of cameras outside her office building. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were red. I want to apologize, she said. Her voice shook. To Ethan Ward, to everyone on that flight, to anyone watching this. She took a breath. I judged a man I didn't know. I mocked him for who I thought he was. And when my life was in danger, he saved me anyway. Tears rolled down her face. I have spent my career believing that success is about titles and money and power. But Ethan Ward taught me something I should have learned long ago. She looked directly at the camera. True greatness is silent. It doesn't need recognition. It just shows up when it matters. The press conference ended. Clara resigned as CEO the next day. Meanwhile, Ethan went back to work. He showed up at the maintenance hangar in Denver, fixed the engines he was contracted to inspect, collected his paycheck. But the airline had other plans. They held a ceremony, presented him with a lifetime flight pass, offered him a job as a training consultant. Ethan accepted the pass, declined the job. I have a daughter to raise, he said simply. The airline did something else, something Ethan hadn't asked for. They donated $100,000 to the Orphans of Fallen Pilots Foundation, in Ethan's name. When a reporter asked him about it, he smiled, a real smile. I don't need medals, he said. Just make sure no child grows up fearing the sky. That night, he flew home. Amelia was waiting at the airport. She ran to him. He lifted her up, hugged her tight. Dad, you're on TV. I know, sweetheart. They said you're a hero. He set her down, looked into her eyes. You know what real heroes do? What? They come home. She hugged him again, and for the first time in 5 years, Ethan felt like he'd landed safely. 1 year later, spring, early morning. The sky was clear and endless. Ethan stood in a small cemetery outside Denver. Amelia held his hand. In front of them was a simple headstone. Sarah Ward, beloved wife and mother. She loved the sky. Ethan placed flowers on the grave. White lilies, Sarah's favorite. Hi, Mom, Amelia whispered. Ethan smiled. She hears you. Behind them, footsteps on grass. Ethan turned. It was Clara. She wore jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was shorter. She carried a bouquet of white roses. I hope it's okay that I came, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. It is. Clara placed the roses next to the lilies. She stood there for a moment, silent. Then she looked at Ethan. I've been volunteering, she said, at a youth center, teaching kids about leadership, real leadership. That's good. I tell them about you, every class. Ethan smiled slightly. I hope you tell them the truth. I do. I tell them I met a man who saved my life, and I almost missed it because I was too busy looking down on him. She wiped her eyes. You taught me more about leadership than my entire career. More than any book or seminar or boardroom. Amelia tugged Ethan's hand. Dad, who is she? Ethan looked at his daughter. Someone who learned an important lesson. Clara knelt down to Amelia's level. Your dad is the bravest person I've ever met. Amelia smiled proudly. I know. He tells me stories about flying. About Mom, too. Your mom must have been amazing. She was a pilot, too, Amelia said. Dad says she taught him to land softly. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Ethan. I didn't know. You never asked. The words weren't cruel, just honest. Clara stood. She extended her hand to Ethan. Thank you for everything, for the lesson, for my life, for showing me what I'd become. He shook her hand. You're welcome. And Clara? Yes? You're not who you were a year ago. That matters. She nodded. Couldn't speak, just nodded. She walked away, across the grass, toward her car. Ethan watched her go. Then he looked up at the sky. A plane flew overhead, a commercial jet. Sunlight glinted off its wings. Amelia pointed. Look, Dad, it's flying. It is. Do you miss it? Flying? Ethan looked at his daughter, her hand in his, her bright eyes, her mother's smile. Sometimes, he said honestly, but I'm exactly where I need to be. They stood there together, father and daughter, under the endless sky. Ethan's voice was soft, almost a whisper. They mock me for looking down, but sometimes you only land safely because someone does. The plane disappeared into the clouds, and Ethan Ward, former fighter pilot, single father, silent hero, smiled. Because he knew something the world was still learning. Respect doesn't demand recognition, it earns it, quietly. Subscribe if you believe respect should always take flight.